Good afternoon. You are tuned in to the Bipartisan Policy Center's event on saving small business. It is now 2:02 Eastern Time, and we're going to go ahead and get started with our outstanding lineup of panelists. This is the third event in BPC's series on small business. The first two events you can find on the BPC website. Today's topic is business owners of color and their communities, the disparate impact that the COVID-19 crisis has had on business owners of color and their communities, and what else needs to be done and must be done to support them. There's been a lot of coverage of that impact, but not enough good ideas proposed about what else needs to be done and how we can put those ideas into action. We have a terrific lineup today. I will not spend a lot of time introducing them. You can find their bios linked in the invitation to this event. You can also find all of them online. We want to save as much time as we can for introductions. I'm going to go around and introduce everyone in the order I see you on my screen. I'll start with my name is Dane Stengler. I'm moderating this event for the Bipartisan Policy Center. We have Rodney Foxworth. He's the CEO of Common Future. Tom Sullivan, the VP of Small Business Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. James Ballantyne, Executive VP at the American Bankers Association. And Nancy Santiago Negron, who's the Community Impact Lead at Eureka and Vice President of Hispanics in Philanthropy. We're going to ask our panelists questions and let them discuss for about 45 minutes. We want to leave the last 15 minutes for questions and answers from the audience. If you are listening out there, there's a Q&A box at the top of your screen on Zoom. There you will be able to submit a question for our panelists, and we will try to get to as many of those questions as we can during the last 15 minutes of this discussion. We're going to open up this discussion with Nancy. Nancy, I believe you have a few slides that are going to help us get started on this discussion, if you'd like to share your screen.
Will do, and thank you everyone for joining us. As I'm setting up to share, I want to thank everyone who's on the call, because if you're on the call, you're either worried about or committed to working for our small business owners right now during this time. So I want to thank you first and foremost, and it's an uphill climb, so I know we're really tired, a lot of us, but I thank you for not giving up. As mentioned, I'm Nancy Santiago, founding member of the Eureka team, which is a platform that we built to help democratize economic opportunity and support our small business owners across the country. But I still work as Vice President of Hispanics in Philanthropy, because as you will see by the end of my presentation, if you're a Latina in the US, you have to have double the number of jobs to reach economic parity, but that's another conversation for another day. Let me take you to what I consider the opening part of this discussion. I'll get through this as quickly as possible. I wanted to provide some context first about the real cost of being an entrepreneur of color, not just in the US in general, but now during this time of COVID. I think it's critically important for us to understand that this disruption and this pandemic has not created the inequities that we're going to be talking about today. What it's done is it's revealed them for the world to see. And I think it's really important for those of us that experienced Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. It did the same thing. The hurricane revealed the systemic flaws and the inequities born out of racial inequity and economic inequity. And that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about today. So I'm going to move us through pretty quickly here. And a lot of folks on the phone know this information. I'll make this deck available for folks who want to see it. There are links embedded. But first, I wanted to talk about the growth of the diverse small business in the US over time. We know that over the last decade, diverse businesses accounted for more than 50% of the 2 million new businesses that have been added on. We understand that they average anywhere between 4.5 to 4.7 million jobs is what they equal in the US, but that minority-owned companies in the United States also provide annual sales totaling close to $700 billion. So this is, for us, a moment in time to reckon with the fact that we probably haven't done what we need to do, what we know we need to do for small business owners of color in this country. I'm going to take you through a little bit of context setting, though, to understand where we are now. I mean, it's important to understand that MBEs struggle with the issue of economic equity and parity and access to capital and access to social capital. But I think you need to understand that it inherently starts from a skewed system of economic inequity. These are numbers here in the US. This is what inequity looks like for just Latinos in the US. And this number down here in your bottom right-hand corner, the fact that the average Latino household was scheduled to lose their median wealth by the year 2073, you need to understand that that number for African Americans is 2053. So what's happening in this country over the past decade is a widening of the race-based wealth gap, and we see that playing out in what happens to our businesses. And I would say, here's another kind of vision of what inequity looks like in the US. And I would offer that this particular slide and the one before it isn't just about Latinos or African Americans living in urban centers in the US. This is all across the US. And I think one of the perceptions that I want to make sure we do away with today is that we're only talking about urban areas or in the areas hardest hit by COVID. This is impacting economies all over the US. And for us, Latinos in particular, we are in rural America. In case you didn't know, the little town of Wilder, Idaho is 76% Latino and has an all Latino local government. And I tell people that to help them understand the complexities of trying to address inequity in a particular community like the Latino community. We need to make sure that we're paying attention to our rural communities as well as our communities in the urban centers, because all of that adds up to the economic situation we're looking at for the US. This is also what racial inequity looks like in the US, an economic inequity, an inequity to healthcare access. This is it. All these headlines have a link embedded. I urge you to read the stories behind them, but this is what we're facing. So at least in the Latino community, I can speak from that perspective, we're talking about a decimation of our wealth. We're talking about a real lack of the progress we've made over the last 2 generations. And we're talking about a disproportionate hit, not just in the total number of deaths, but we're talking about the reality of 2/3 of our community having lost jobs or economic stability. This is all very real and it's happening in real time. I'll take you to this slide because it's not just the cost of doing business as a Black or brown entrepreneur in this country that's significant. Because of the high cost, it takes its toll on us in our ability to survive, our survival rates as businesses. So on average, Black, Latino, and women founders start their businesses with an equivalent of 50% of what their white counterparts start a business with. So that already puts us at a deficit. Loan rejection rates are 37 times higher for African Americans and 23 times higher for Latinos. We're talking an average loan size for diverse entrepreneurs being somewhere in the area of $9,300, whereas for the white counterparts, the average loan size to start your business is somewhere around $20,000, almost 21. And because the cost of doing business as an entrepreneur of color is so high and the access to good capital is so difficult, this is what the situation that we find ourselves in. This was a report released in September of 2019, so not very long ago, by JP Morgan Chase, looking at kind of place-based issues related to our entrepreneurs of color. And on average, most small businesses that are owned by Black and Latino entrepreneurs have fewer than 14 days cash buffer. And we are on week 7. So that tells you something about the survivability of our community. And then we move into the Paycheck Protection Program. We're looking at the real numbers as of last week. So 3% of all the dollars going out are going to minority-owned businesses. This is a problem. And I would argue that even though it was designed in theory to help small businesses survive, we know that upwards of 90% of businesses owned by people of color have been effectively shut out. Now, those are numbers, like I said, as of last week. This last go round with funds, that may change some. I would argue it's probably not going to get about beyond 4%. And when we get to that 4%, it's because of the CDFI factor built in. So I'm going to kind of end that and offer up a resource that we do have on the Eureka website. Please go visit it. The website to sign up is absolutely free. We urge any entrepreneur to get on there, ask questions. This is not just a community of experts. It's a community with their peers. What's really important right now in this moment is to understand that financial capital decoupled from strategic support coaching and mentoring is only going to delay the inevitable. It's not going to change outcomes. So we're hoping, as part of the conversation we have today, to talk about the importance of the coaching and strategic support we need to supply to our entrepreneurs to help them not just financially survive another month, but to be able to make it out of this pandemic. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop there and we'll bring it on back. And
Thanks, Nancy. Thank you. That was a great start. You make a number of different points that I hope we come back to in this discussion. I hope especially we get a chance to hear more about Eureka. And I want to highlight one thing in particular. You talked about the financial importance, the importance of loans and the financing gap for the businesses we were talking about, but also that coaching and strategic support. So I think that's a really important point, that this is not just about money. This is about other forms of support for these businesses during the crisis and after the crisis as well.
Money helps. Money does help.
Of course, money absolutely helps. I would also point viewers, point our audience. BPC put up a blog post yesterday. There's so much good data out there on this, as Nancy has just highlighted, and we tried to collect and highlight some of it in a blog post published yesterday, as a starting point to this topic. Rodney, I want to turn to you now. There's obviously been a lot of attention on small businesses, rightly so, over the last month or two, and the impact of the crisis on them, small businesses of all types. But your organization, Common Future, works with another kind of organization. You work especially with entrepreneurial support and small business support organizations, as well as others. And they don't get as much of attention, either for the role that they're playing or the impact that the crisis is having on them. Can you take us through what you and Common Future are seeing? Talk about the role of these organizations and how you see their role both in the crisis and after the crisis.
Absolutely. And Dane, I'm just really happy to be a part of this conversation with so many wonderful leaders in the space. And so thank you for Bipartisan Policy Center for convening us. I do want to quickly double down on everything that Nancy pointed out, because it is true that while money is not the only factor right now, it's a critically important factor, especially when we look at it from a racial lens. And when we think about the racial wealth gap that Nancy articulated so beautifully, we typically think of these things as only historical factors that get us to these points. But when Nancy speaks about the loan rejection rates for African American, Latino prospective entrepreneurs and business owners, when we look at the relative size of the loans relative to white entrepreneurs and business owners, that's a contemporary dynamic. And so it's not just the historical context. I think it's really important as we look to both recover and hopefully restructure moving out of this devastating pandemic, which, as we know, will have long-term implications to our economy. And then the final thing I will add to that, and I'm so glad that I was able to follow after Nancy, is that typically we think about these challenges for small business owners and entrepreneurs of color is only challenges that are specific to those communities. When in fact, as Nancy pointed out, when we're looking at, and this is prior to COVID, the estimation that if the economy were to perform as it had been at its inequitable pace, that for Latino households, wealth would drop to zero in 2073, and for African Americans in 2053. The reality is that this country is becoming majority people of color. And so what does it look like when we are in fact excluding so much of the business creation, the wealth creation in communities with the population that actually will be the majority of this country? And so that's not just a challenge for Latino and African American people, that's actually a challenge to our entire economy. And that's going to be, and it's being acutely revealed right now with COVID. And so I just wanted to make sure that we made that segue and link. To your question, Dane, I'm really glad that community development financial institutions, CDFIs, and minority depository institutions were included more specifically in this current CARES Act iteration. And we have also ignored a critical group of institutions that have been doing so much work prior to COVID and currently, when you talk about entrepreneur support and small business support organizations, many of whom do provide financial support as well. But to Nancy's point, providing a lot of the mentorship, coaching, technical assistance, trusted guidance, as our friends at the Association for Enterprise Opportunity term it. And it's just critical for us to understand the role that they play. And we don't talk about these institutions much. And quite frankly, when we look at our network and we look at the amazing groupings of small business and entrepreneurial support organizations across the country, they are sort of like the first line of defense in so many ways for a lot of the entrepreneurs that we're talking about, right? A lot of communities that we're talking about. If we're being frank, and AEO put out a report a few years ago that articulated that one of the primary barriers for African-American businesses, for example, is a lack of trust with traditional financial institutions, right? And so there's those barriers there, many of which are well-founded for that lack of trust, unfortunately. And at the same time, when you have other alternative institutions that are actually really focused and keened in on the needs of the community of entrepreneurs in which they're situated with, we need to continuously uplift those types of organizations. And unfortunately, we thought about the economic recovery and restructuring moving forward. We have completely disregarded and minimized the role that these phenomenal ecosystem builders and entrepreneurial support, small business support organizations play. These are the organizations that, as many of the folks now network, whether you're thinking about a mortar in Cincinnati or you're thinking about a rising tide in New Jersey, they're able to access and have engagement with small business owners and entrepreneurs in ways that a lot of financial institutions are just unable to have. They are trusted, they're organizing in community with these folks. As I like to say, many of the people who run these organizations that are part of our network are constantly in conversation, like in text, phone calls, etc., with small business owners and entrepreneurs, and they have those relationships. And so when we think about the role that these organizations play in a day-to-day prior to COVID, we also need to be thinking about what does it look like if we're trying to drive financial and intellectual resources to entrepreneurs and small business owners of color. We really need to make sure there's a role for these organizations that really allow us to get to the population of small business and entrepreneurs that right now, unfortunately, the Paycheck Protection Program is leaving out of the equation. And so what are the opportunities for us to actually build differently to be able to do that? Well, we know that, for example, obviously the way that the Paycheck Protection Program is operating, it's specifically geared towards now, thankfully, CDFIs, NDIs, and banks, but those are financial institutions, and ESOs and small business support organizations are not. And I think there's an opportunity to actually leverage the relational infrastructure that so many of these institutions have built out with small business owners and entrepreneurs, in which we can actually deliver capital to them in ways that we have not been able to do in our existing infrastructure, whether we're talking about SBA, et cetera. And I think this is really critically important because for our network and other networks like AEO and others, we're principally focusing on communities that are focused on communities of color, rural communities, and to Nancy's point, those are not mutually exclusive. We typically think about them being mutually exclusive, but they are in fact not. And so really there's an opportunity on the table for us to actually reconceptualize how we leverage these organizations as relational institutions that can drive resources more directly to entrepreneurs and small business owners, right? These are the folks, again, who are working on business plans that have been supporting their first phone call that many of these entrepreneurs and small business owners they have, right? When they're struggling, when they're needing some support. And so these organizations typically understand the nuances in which their small businesses and entrepreneurs are being impacted by, and being able to construct a way for us to actually leverage that infrastructure, that relational infrastructure, to more explicitly drive resources and capital directly to entrepreneurs of color and small businesses. It's just something that's been clearly absent from the way that we've thought about our public policy in this moment.
Thanks, Rodney. I especially like the way you frame the role of ecosystem building organizations and these support organizations, their role in trust and relationships in these places. And I think that should be a key theme. I think we'll see it. We'll hear it in some of the other panelist discussions. That's a really key idea you put forth there. Thanks for those comments. And I think you're right. That's absolutely an important sector that hasn't gotten enough attention and that should be targeted for more support. Tom, I want to turn to you. But both Nancy and Rodney have mentioned the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. We're here talking on a Wednesday. The second round of PPP funding was just passed by Congress last Friday. I saw this morning one estimate that those funds could even be depleted by tomorrow and possibly early next week at the latest. Talk us through, it's not clear if in a phase 4 there's going to be more support for small business. Talk us through what you are seeing, what you are hearing, your view. Is there an appetite for more support? If there is, what might that support look like? How might it be different? And as well as what other support should we be looking for besides just more and more money being put into this program?
Thank you, Dane. Well, where to start? I guess first of all, there better be an appetite for more support. You can't see a program that has demand at SBA. You can't see a program that does 14 years of lending in 14 days. Then they pause, they restart, and now we'll see the same type of demand in the program and not admit that more money is needed. And I think particular to this question, especially when you look at the data that Nancy showed, we can't afford for there not to be more money because, as Nancy had said, capital is darn important, and all of these other things are important too, but capital is critically important. We did a MetLife survey right in the middle of this pandemic, where we asked small businesses to rank, what do they need? Do they need grants? Do they need loans? Do they need information? And by far, the majority of the small businesses we surveyed said, we need cash. And then the second choice was loans, third choice, information. So I am going to be doing everything we can to make sure that Congress knows there's an appetite. But getting really at the point of this discussion, that this restoration of funds to the PPP lending program came with it the acknowledgement that there are parts of the small business community that desperately need the funds and they're not getting it. And how do we do that? And so CDFIs, smaller banks, credit unions, all are carved out for $60 billion portion of the $310 billion that Congress has said should go to small business loans. Now, we know that that's not enough, but we also know that that is forcing an extremely valuable infrastructure to be up and running and get capital to small businesses to anticipate Congress giving more money. So what we saw in the beginning was that SBA lenders, 1,800 banks, were the first to loan. You fast forward to 16 days ago when they ran out of money, there were 4,700 banks. And I think our guest, James Ballantyne, will explain this in more detail later in this event. But there still aren't enough CDFIs who are up and running and lending to get to that gap that Nancy referenced in her material. So when they're getting ready now, even if some entrepreneurs of color don't get the money now, then they're setting the infrastructure up to be successful when Congress puts more money out and CDFIs have access. And I think really the significant challenge that we're in the middle of is how fast this is all moving. When we surveyed those small businesses, 6 weeks ago, they said in 2 weeks, 50% of them would have to close their doors. That was four weeks ago. So they're closed. And so we're trying to push money out as fast as we can. And Rodney, I think, touched on a really fascinating point, is that in order to get the trust with lenders, in order to get the education that's needed to understand what the heck PPP is all about, there have to be relationships. And that's why at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, we're so proud to be partners with the Minority Business Development Agency, MBDA. You may know, Dane, that in the CARES Act that actually created this whole loan program, they specifically are giving money and empowering minority business centers all across the United States to start this education to the minority small businesses so they understand what they need to be asking a CDFI or a lender. But that takes time. And it takes time to build the relationships, and it builds the trust. And sometimes we can't afford that time. So there is a rush. I was thrilled to see that CDFIs were included in the latest round of funding. And I want to make sure that folks know, both who are dialed into this event as well as distinguished folks on our panel, that even if money runs out next week and CDFIs are not able to move as much money as they want, it will not be for nothing, because they will be getting their infrastructure in order so that when there is this next round of funding, they're ready to go. And hopefully you'll see that portion of the pie expand on Nancy's chart the next time we have this discussion.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for highlighting kind of that the background, kind of the mechanics that have to happen behind the scene for the financial institutions to make this a reality. James, you have the advantage of having heard your three other fellow panelists already talk. So I do have a specific question I want to ask you, but I also want to give you a chance as the last one to kind of give an opening remark. Is there anything you want to highlight or respond to what you've heard from the other panelists? But before I ask you a question.
Sure, I certainly enjoyed hearing Nancy, Rodney, and Tom speak of the current state of affairs. And as they were speaking, I was reminded of a quote from a banker years ago. He said, and he was a banker for a minority institution, and he said, James, one thing you have to realize is that when other communities catch a cold, minority communities catch pneumonia. And that certainly reminded me when I heard Nancy and Rodney speak to that, because there are certain issues within the minority community that have to be resolved. And when the funding was being considered for the PPP program in the second round, and there was discussion around setting aside at least $30 billion for institutions 10 and below, and I was speaking with my friends at various CDFIs around the country, and they said it's not that we could not access the system. That was not the issue in the first round. It's that the patient form by which we have to work with our borrowers requires time. And if there's a race to the finish to get this money out the door, we're concerned that some of our borrowers will be left behind. And that's why it was important for this this particular guarantee. I'm not calling it a set aside. Others have called it a set aside. It's a guarantee of at least $30 billion. And I think that is certainly fair and appropriate. So everything that Nancy, Rodney, and Tom have highlighted certainly is important. And I think if there's one thing about any crisis situation, and I've been through a few of them within the financial services sector, if there's one thing that's important, it gives you a chance to step back to see how certain communities can react and are reacting and how they're impacted. And in this case, I think we're seeing some very stark differences in how certain communities are being impacted by not only the virus, but also the financial needs of those communities. Because if you have a well-established business, I don't care if it was a construction company or a beauty salon, you're going to be impacted by everything that's going on. And that beauty salon, while they can take on a PPP loan or something that may be coming forward, they're also not just taking on the loan to keep their business open, they're taking on additional debt as well. And that may be challenging for them to recover from going forward associated with that debt, because business may not turn on as it had in January. In August of this year, while you may have customers coming into the beauty salon, it may be a trickle as opposed to a full pour. And that is going to be the next leg, I think, of the stool, is taking on the debt, and also how we get through this process and return back to some normalcy, which will again help the books of those minority businesses. So certainly enjoyed that conversation. And Dane, you'll have to remind me of your question, because I'll start going on and on about other things. But
no, thanks, James. Thanks for those observations. Yeah, I want to ask you exactly about what you mentioned, which is a crisis, in addition to an immediate response, also gives everyone a chance to kind of step back and reevaluate and learn. And I want to ask you about some of those learnings for, the ABA, your members. We heard from the other panelists about, the existing disparities when it comes to financing for small business owners of color when they're starting their business, when they're trying to grow their business. The data show that small business owners of color are much more likely to rely on their own personal savings to fund and grow a business. As we heard from Nancy and Tom and Rodney, some of those reasons are they're unbanked or they're underbanked. There's lack of trust. There's all sorts of reasons there. What are you and your members learning about how we can enhance utilization and access of financial institutions among this population?
it's very important lessons, I think, for everyone, because there is a large unbanked population out there. There are a number of businesses that are still financing via credit card. And Tom and I go back to our days at SBA, where we've done a lot of analysis on that. And we know there are businesses that operate in that way, or they're operating through the friends and family network system in order to get certain loans funded. And that's a very important process for many of them. And it's very important that they have that access to that line of credit with their friends and family, but that's not sustainable. And that's not something that you can continue. And as we saw during this crisis, and this is sort of lessons learned, is that when you don't have a relationship with the financial institution, that was one of the components of the PPP program, that you would have had a relationship with the financial institution prior to February 15th or something around that date. And it really hampered many minority businesses, or any business, not just minority, but any business that did not have that ongoing relationship with a financial institution where you can call them up to say, we need your help, we need your loan. You became a new customer. Keep in mind, for the PPP program, if you go back and listen to any of the press conferences where Treasury Secretary Mnuchin spoke, he told the banks, go to your existing customers. Those are the people you need to go to first, because you have the know your customer requirements in, you have the BSA information in, and those are the individuals you should go to first. Well, if those are the individuals that banks were told to go to first, not only are they going to do that, but it also is going to leave a large segment of businesses outside of the immediate population, which is why there was so much criticism in the round one obligations. It's because banks were going to the customers that they had in their portfolio.
Thanks, James. That's a really excellent point, and thanks for the reminder about some of that guidance that the banks received. Nancy, I want to come back to you. There's a couple issues I want to raise. One is, we've not talked about the traditional financial institutions. You and your team at Eureka are working on alternative pathways. And there's been a lot of other ideas floating around there about alternative distribution channels for the funds. I want to know your thoughts on how we ensure that any alternative pathways that are opened up have greater equity and greater participation for business owners of color. And then I want to ask you again about your point about coaching and strategic support, and how we even begin to conceptualize support for that, because it's certainly the case that small businesses, young businesses, new businesses aren't going to have the wherewithal to pay for that kind of support right now. So I wonder what kind of ideas you have for providing that support in addition to the financial support.
Sure. And, I want to say something before I go into the alternative measures. I am struck with something, and you told me I could push a little bit, Dane, so I'm going to push here. We have this big question still on the table. And my big question is, why are we running out to buy a smoke detector when the house is already on fire, right? The reality is that we have known for decades that SBA has not been serving the needs of Black and brown entrepreneurs. On average, their numbers are 2%. Congress knew that. We've all known that. Those of us in this space have been there. We know there's a fault there and there's a break in the system, but we've not prioritized fixing it. And this is the entity that's being held accountable for providing services to the small business owners in our country. So we need to really pay attention to that. And I think we've done ourselves a huge disservice over the years by not paying attention to that 2% rate that continues to be 2%. So it's no surprise that PPP is at 3%, right? We're using the same kind of flawed system. One. Two, we also knew that banks were going to need certain guidance because, to your point, James, when they're giving guidance to work with their existing customers, that's what they're going to do. Why take that extra step, especially when you're trying to move so quickly? So we kind of set ourselves up on that one. We have an entity that has not been able to deploy dollars to communities of color or minority entrepreneurs the way it's intended to. We know those numbers are bad, and nobody's asked that question. So I do want us to talk about alternatives, but I need us to reprioritize our focus on fixing broken systems. And if we can't fix those systems, then we need a new one, right? And so let's be clear about the world we're moving into post-COVID is going to be drastically different than the one we just left. And if we go back to normal, we're doing the country a disservice because we're going back to the inequities that got us here in the first place. So let's start with that. And now I'll move into kind of the alternatives. And I'll tell you why these alternatives are so critically important. Right now, as it stands, 50% of all Latino businesses are not coming back. Right now, that's our number. Confirmed by financial analysts in different places, both on the government side and the private sector, 50% are not coming back. And so if we don't come up with alternatives quickly, we're talking about a real problem in the country that's going to be struggling to survive economically. We need every last one of those businesses firing at all cylinders for us to get out of this in a way that we don't have to worry about fractured systems for the long term. On our end, I think that we've seen, I'm a big fan of CDFIs. When I left the Obama administration, I went to work for CDFIs because I believe in the work that they do. I do also, though, understand very much that there's limited bandwidth there. And there's absolutely work and provide that we can do to help build out that system, help them work better, help them increase their capacity. There's work to be done there. FinTech can be a real important part of how we move some of that, but I do believe that there's some caution that we all need to take with that as well. In some cases, FinTech has been used to allow for predatory lending, and that's not what we want, right? So we want them to work in concert with organizations that we know are committed to providing good, smart capital into our communities. I would also say that to Rodney's point, entrepreneur serving institutions are critical components of this work. As we talk about not just credibility and trust, but the ability to push past the noise with credibility and push past the noise quickly to get the right information into people's hands to move quickly. That's what our ESOs do, particularly our nonprofit ones. Our entrepreneur serving organizations should be places that are able to provide the support to people. They have the resources, they have the knowledge of those businesses. What they lack is the capital to deploy. So we have a system that may work, quite honestly, better than the ones that we've had in place for decades. I would also say that as we think about capital to deploy, we have to make sure we're providing our nonprofit partners with the support they need, right? So let's think about the fact that 30% of our nonprofits may not come back after COVID. So what does that mean for our ESOs that happen to be nonprofit? We need to be paying attention to that as well. And finally, for organizations like Eureka, this was not on our kind of plan of things to do, but as a tech-enabled platform that that is providing free coaching and mentoring to entrepreneurs, we saw the need to very quickly use our technology to reach people. We knew we had the pipeline. We know we have the access points. We also know that because of the experience of someone like Melissa Bradley, who's our co-founder, and myself, that spent years in government deploying big federal grants, we had the knowledge and the ability to both administer grants quickly and be able to get into the communities we most needed. So we have, and I'm happy to share the deck, and I put information in there, and I see the Facebook behind Tom's on his backdrop. So 2 organizations came to us to support them in getting their grants to those small business owners that we know weren't going to get access. So we administered the Facebook grants that are being delivered now to small businesses, and that's happening. It's already just closed actually, but that's happening right now. And we were able to recruit not just the judges that look like the entrepreneurs we're trying to serve, but the entrepreneurs in the communities we know we needed to serve. We also made sure that these things were available in Spanish. Not every Latino business owner needs it in Spanish, but there's a welcoming that you're signaling to people that you're safe here if they know they can ask you questions in different languages. So we made sure to make that available. We are now administering the Salesforce grants, and Salesforce was very smart in their design in making sure that they coupled the deployment of capital with the coaching and the mentoring that they know is going to be needed. So part of what we're looking for are not just opportunities to deploy capital, but to deploy it with the support and the wraparound services that folks are going to need. We are doing it now. We're doing it online. Folks can sign up. I'll send out the information, but we're imploring folks to jump on and come on board. The other thing we've done is Eureka, because it's a platform, we've allowed our nonprofit partners that didn't have a way to go virtual on our platform. So now we not only have the entrepreneur serving institutions, our own pipeline, information in different languages, and coaches available to provide free mentoring and support, but we also have a place where nonprofits that serve communities of color are calling home for the time being. And with their support, we're able to reach faster into communities. And they're able to not just conduct their own business as a nonprofit, but send us in our pipeline the people that most need the services. The YWCA of USA is one of the biggest partners we have. And right now we know women entrepreneurs are in the same boat. And so part of what I'm recommending is we take a look at the faulty systems and finally fix them, because that's supposed to be where our capacity exists. And because we can't do that at the moment, really look at our CDFIs and our entrepreneur serving institutions to really provide that additional support to people on the ground real time. And finally, think about some of the partners like Eureka that have the nimbleness and the technology that can help partner with our ESOs to move quickly and to get the dollars to where they're most needed first.
Rodney, part of what Nancy is pointing to here, which is a really important point, is not only that things will be very different after the crisis, but that when it comes to small business, when it comes to business owners of color in their communities, not only are we going to have significantly fewer, because as Nancy points out, a very large percentage of businesses, in Nancy's case, you cited the numbers on Latino-owned businesses, not only have a large number of those fail, but a large number are probably on the cusp of failing. In addition, we know that new business formation is down 40 or 50% compared to comparable weeks a year ago. So we're not getting that replenishment, which is not surprising. But on the other side of this, 2, 3, 4 months, we're not only going to be down significant shares from existing small business, we're not going to have those new small businesses that in ordinary times we see. What do we need to do? What do we need to be thinking about for that restart on the other side of it? And what can public and private institutions do today and then after the crisis to start rebuilding that pipeline?
Thanks for the question, Dane. And you either made a critical mistake or had us planned out to have me following Nancy, because I think because everything that Nancy articulated is exactly getting to the heart of the matter. And we've been sidestepping this piece of the conversation, not just in this panel, but just like broadly, right? In terms of we're thinking about we need to fix things and we also have to restructure things as well, right? And I think this is the reality that we're faced with. Obviously, Nancy laid forth many data points that folks might not even be familiar with, quite frankly. I do think that while so many people will recognize some of the inequities that are reinforced by not just SBA, but the more traditional banking system. And those are unfortunate realities that we need to confront because COVID is exposing so much of the fragility of the systems that we already had in place. And so unfortunately, that means that we need to be thinking much more about not just like alternatives at the margins, but actually complete restructures, right? Like new structures, leveraging existing relational infrastructure that has completely been undercapitalized, ignored, excluded for too long. And so that's really the heart of the matter. And so when you're talking about Latino businesses, 50% not coming back, let's be clear about this as well. It's not as though communities of color, particularly Latino and African American communities, were recovered from the 2008 crisis, right? And so that means that people were still living in crisis at that point. And so we're starting to see some recovery happening, and then COVID happens, right? So very similarly, significant amount of Black wealth was lost during the economic crisis of 2008. And as our friends at AEO continuously point out, for African Americans in particular, business ownership is actually the primary driver for wealth creation and mitigating the racial wealth gap. So when we're talking about the existing infrastructure being sort of reinvested into, and we're surprised by these returns on the investment, we shouldn't be surprised because this is effectively how it's operated before. And so where the challenge, I think, is, and the opportunity really, is completely restructuring and rethinking how these systems operate, really starting from what the actual challenge problem is. If we recognize that, for example, 50% of Latino businesses are not going to come back from this crisis, well, then let's start from there, right? What's the problem that we're actually trying to solve? If the problem is that part of the problem that we're trying to solve is ensuring that there's an equitable and responsive recovery that acknowledges both the contemporary crisis, but the historical crises that have persisted, that means that we have to be much more deliberate about structuring institutional responses at a public and private level that really acknowledges that, and those deficiencies. And so, perfect example, even when we were talking about the inclusion of CDFIs or minority depository institutions in this current tranche, well, part of that, we probably needed to include like an equity injection of capital as well into this equation, because we know that CDFIs and MDIs are undercapitalized relative to other financial institutions. And so the limitations of the current structure requires that there actually be some more money on the table, because it's a guarantee, as James pointed out. It's a guarantee, it's not a set aside, right? It might be considered in some ways as equity, but it's not really structured in a way given the guidance that's been afforded. We talk about a lot of institutions like ESOs or small business support organizations. These are not financial intermediaries or banking institutions. Many of them, however, consistently, particularly the ones now in network, create loan funds and other funding products precisely because their population and communities are not being served by existing financial institutions, including some CDFIs. And so I think recognizing that fact of like, how do we actually create some alternative pathways for capitalizing these, to Nancy's point, the nonprofit partners first, and ensuring that they have pathways to actually be able to deliver resources. But we have to actually start with the fundamental question of, we're seeing with this crisis, we're going to see significant devastation. It's unfortunate, but I've almost accepted that there's going to be a level of decimated wealth in African-American and Latino communities. Like, that's happening. It's happened already. It's going to continue to happen. So then what do we restructure after that? How do we ensure that we actually not only recover, but actually restructure? And so that means a critical reexamination of not just SBA, the Federal Reserve, our relationship with those public institutions to the traditional larger banking institutions. How do we create alternatives that way? And to Nancy's point, even though fintech is a promising opportunity, we also know that, yes, there's the Eurekas of the world, but there are also some fintech that are already basically reinforcing the institutional biases that other institutions before them have. And so it's not, we can't look at this as a simple one-off, solution. It's actually much more complex than that. But the fundamental thing that we need to do is ensure that we're actually not just looking at a recovery mindset and sort of bolstering what already existed. We need to fundamentally restructure things. And again, that has to be principled. If Nancy's point about the 2% minorities, SBA lending, You look at the 7A program, 3% for African Americans, I think 6% for Latino entrepreneurs, 14% in 2019 for women. Well, that's a problem, right? And so we already recognize that. So then how do we build infrastructures that recognize the relational elements that happen on the ground with ESOs, small business support organizations, institutions like Eureka, that recognize the fundamental ability to have those relationships that, quite frankly, the institutions that have been structured within the current recovery and response to recovery, many do not have. And I'm speaking in generalities. I'm not saying that this is of everyone, but we're talking about disproportionate impact here, right? And so that is the conversation that we need to be in at this point, because when you really think about it, I think there are estimates of $1.5 trillion needed to be out there to support small businesses. So at that point, we'll probably be close at the next tranche to getting to that number. But then the question is, what businesses, what communities were most impacted by those resources? And to Nancy's point, if we're surprised in, say, August that the numbers were, say 3% minorities and people of color had access to that resources, it should not be a surprise to anyone, because that's how the structures were built. And so, I hate to not answer your question as specifically as you want me to, Dane, but I think the reality of it is we have to be fundamentally restructuring and leveraging the existing relational capacity of groups like Eureka and other ESOs and small business organizations in partnership with government and philanthropy.
Thanks, Rodney. By my true to the nature of a time limited but substantive discussion, by my clock, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. We've got questions coming in. Reminder to the audience that the Q&A function at the top or bottom, but I think the top of your screen can be used to submit a question. James and Tom, I want to turn to you here in the last couple of minutes. James, we've talked a lot about financial institutions, traditional banks, CDFIs. Rodney mentioned the Federal Reserve. There is this, as Rodney said, it's not a set aside, but there's this carve out or intended dedicated stream within the newest round of PPP for CDFIs below a certain asset level. A couple of questions for you, as I know the ABA has been active on these issues. How do we ensure, what needs to be true to ensure that that money can actually be distributed through the CDFIs? I've heard some people express concerns about the capacity of CDFIs to handle these large amounts of money that are hoped to flow through them. And then when it comes to the Federal Reserve and their new Main Street programs, what are some of the things that you think need to be done there to make sure that program, those facilities, can help the communities and the business owners that we're talking about?
I see the Main Street lending facility and the PPP program being obviously entirely different program. The Main Street lending program is really geared towards businesses that have 10,000 or less employees, and the loans can range anywhere from $1 million up to $25 million. That is certainly something that any business can fit themselves into, but it's not built for the small mom and pop businesses that many of our minority communities operate in right now and provide the fantastic service. Although I don't have any hair, I miss my barber because he does shape up my chin. So he would not go to the Main Street lending facility to get $1 million loan, because that will be well above the capacity that they need. So there are multiple avenues, and I think the states have been very innovative. Local communities have been very innovative with loan programs. The Main Street lending facility is something that will help a number of businesses that need that type of loan. So I can imagine any minority business that has a construction company would certainly need anywhere from $1 million to $25 million in loans, and that will be of benefit to them. As it relates to your question, I'll go quickly here on CDFIs and how that money can be reserved for them. I know there's still additional efforts to set aside money for CDFIs, even within the construct of the PPP program right now. And I think those efforts will continue. We need to keep in mind the patient form of capital that's needed for these businesses. I am very concerned about businesses being strapped with too much debt. It is not going to help them. It will help them short term. It will not help them long term. And that's something that we need to be mindful of going forward. But again, CDFIs do important work. Ben's Chili Bowl in the area just got their loan from a CDFI bank. I was not going to rest until Ben's Chili Bowl got their loan, and that CDFI institution, City First DC, delivered for them. So they do great work. They'll continue to do great work. Just allow them to work at their own pace with the community that they traditionally serve.
Thanks, James. For your sake, I hope both your barber and Ben's Chili Bowl get to make it through this. Tom, we've got just a couple minutes left, and so if we have time, we can circle back to your fellow panelists. But I want to ask you this future-looking question that James and Rodney and Nancy have all raised. So, you know, I know you think a lot about technology and how businesses, especially small businesses, use technology or can use technology. So I'd be curious in your thoughts on, you know, what our organizations can do to help businesses through the use of technology. I'm also curious what your thoughts are on what policies do we need to reevaluate, revisit that are not the SBA. We've obviously talked a lot about the SBA. We talked a little bit about the Fed. What are other policies we need to rethink or revisit when we talk about rebuilding these communities, these small businesses, you know, after the crisis? As Rodney said, not just a recovery, but kind of a complete restart. What are the other things we need to be keeping in mind?
Sure, in 30 seconds. So I'll start off by giving an answer that you asked the other panelists, and that is, what's it going to take to restart? You know, what types of government policies are needed to restart? I tend to approach things very simply, from you put your left foot here, you put your right foot here, and you go forward. I think it's actually really simple from a government policy perspective. When a government makes decisions, you either make a decision that is going to reward a business to restart or to punish the business that restarts. And it's only going to work if that government at a local level, state level, regional, and national level answer that question in regulation after regulation after regulation. Yes, protect the employees. Yes, protect the customers. However, it has got to be done through the lenses of, am I rewarding this business to restart? Because I think Nancy hit it very, very well. Because if we're not looking at it that way, then we're not going to get the economy going again the way that we need. Now, as far as technology goes, again, I approach things really, really simply. There's a relationship component that Rodney has mentioned in both of his answers. It's hugely important. And we're in the middle of the pandemic. The house is on fire. Those relationships are being forced. There are relationships at CDFI, at Black-owned banks, at national brand banks, at fintechs. We cannot lose those relationships, because it's those relationships, understanding technology, trusting a lender, or bolstering your relationship with the CDFI. Those relationships are going to help lessen that gap that existed before the pandemic, and unfortunately may be exacerbated after the pandemic. I'll give you an example. In the world that I generally operate in, I'm constantly helping small businesses get access to information and guidance and counseling. We go to SCORE, small business development centers, and women business centers. It's like the three. It rolls off the tongue all the time when we're talking with business organizations. We don't talk about the minority business centers, primarily because they're run out of a different government agency, out of the Department of Commerce. And the CARES Act forced that relationship into the equation. We can't lose that, because the conversation has to include those minority business centers in the same conversations that happen with the ESOs counseling, with the women business centers and others. Because if folks are learning, then they're going to be able to trust and use technology. Dane, I'll end with just a really quick example that really accentuates the lack of knowledge, lack of trust, lack of use. How many folks knew that if you had QuickBooks, if you had been using QuickBooks by Intuit, how many people knew that you could actually be accessing PPP loans this week through that platform? My guess is that because of the lack of relationships, lack of trust, relatively disproportionately low number of the minority business community knew that that existed. And that can be solved through these types of relationships going forward.
Thanks, Tom. We have now hit the exact 60-minute mark. So I want to commend all of you for your eloquence. You all spoke in complete paragraphs. It was incredibly substantive, and I want to thank you all for your time. You have all raised incredibly freighted issues, incredibly weighty issues that BPC and I know your organizations and other partners hope to continue working on. So hopefully this conversation is just the beginning. I know you're all right in the middle of it, but this is certainly not the end of what we hope to do on this. So thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to our audience for watching. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Dane.